Good day. We've reached chapter 6, which is on subqueries. Objectives of this chapter is to describe the types of problem that subqueries can solve, to define subqueries, to list the different types of subqueries, and then to write single row and multiple row subqueries. The objectives of this session is to understand the concept of using a subquery to solve a problem, to understand the subquery syntax and apply the guidelines for subqueries, and to understand and use single row subqueries to solve problems that are appropriate for single row subqueries. The problem that we want to do for using a subquery is the following. The question is, which books retail or sell for more than the book that is titled Shortest Poems? Display the titles and the retail prices of these books. Now, first we're going to discuss the solution or the problem. Without scanning the BK Books and BK Cost tables physically to see that this book retails for $39.95, you have to write and use a subquery or an inner query to determine what this book retails for. The question says, which books retail for more than the book titled Shortest Poems? But the problem is, we don't know what is the retail price for Shortest Poems. Now, you can go and look it up in your data listing and then say, oh, okay, this book retails for $39.95, and then in your solution you say where retail price is greater than $39.95. But you are not allowed to do it because you were not given $39.95. You were only given the title of the book. So your query must find out what does it retail for, and then use that result in your solution. So with other words, we've got a query within a query, and therefore we call it a subquery. Oracle will use your subquery to determine what the book retails for and replace the retail price in your subquery with $39.95. As you probably know, your subquery must look like this. Okay, the part of the subquery must look like this. Select retail from BK Books and BK Costs, where B ISBN is C ISBN and a title equals Shortest Poems. This query will give you the answer of $39.95, but you're not allowed to do two queries. You can only write one query and then effectively one query inside another query. I strongly recommend that you enter your subquery first to see whether your subquery returns a correct result, namely $39.95 in this case. As soon as you get the correct result for the subquery, open your SQL editor by saying ed and add the code listed in blue below in front of the subquery. Also add brackets around your subquery to complete your answer because the subquery must be written in brackets. The code listed in blue represents the outer or main query, which lists the complete answer to the problem listed on the previous slide, and the code in green represents your subquery or inner query, as it's also called. So the complete solution therefore is then select title and retail from BK Books, BK Cost, where B ISBN equals C ISBN and the retail is greater than, and now the subquery in green, select retail from BK Books, BK Cost, where B.ISBN is C ISBN and the title equals Shortest Poems. Like we said, first only type in the green part, because the green part will then give you the answer of $39.95, and then you can go to the editor and then add the code in blue above the code in green, so that in the editor you've got the whole solution that you see now in front of you, the blue part and the green part. And if you then run your query, it will give you the correct results. Note that we have looked at an example of how a subquery can help us to solve problems that require a subquery. Let us have a look at the syntax of a subquery as listed below. Now, in the rectangle, I've given you my version of the syntax. Select the select list from the table or tables where expression, operator, subquery in green. The subquery or the inner query executes once before the main or the outer query. So what Oracle does is, Oracle first executes the green subquery, and then it uses the result of the green subquery, replaces it in the where clause of the outer or main query, and executes the outer or main query. The result of the subquery is then used to complete a query condition for the main query. You can place a subquery in a where clause, a having clause, or a from clause, as we'll see later in this chapter and in chapter 11. Operator in the syntax represents a comparison operator, which may be all the comparison operators, for example, or any of the comparison operators, namely in, any, or all, which we'll also discuss later in examples. Subquery guidelines. I've already said that you have to enclose your subquery in parentheses. Place your subqueries on the right side of the comparison condition. So do indenting because it increases the readability. If you can go back to the previous slide, look at where my subquery is on the right hand side of the main query. The order by clause is not needed in a subquery unless you are performing top-end analysis, which we're going to do in chapter 11. Don't worry about that now. Specify your order by clause in your main query. Use single row operators with single row subqueries and use multiple row operators with multiple row subqueries. We will see later on what single row subqueries and multiple row subqueries are, because it's very important to distinguish between single row and multiple row operators, because if you know whether it's single row or multiple row subqueries, then you can use single row or multiple row operators. Single row subqueries. A single row subquery must return one row only and must use any one of the single row comparison operators, namely greater, equal, less than, not equal, or less than equal. So a single subquery must return one row only. That is the main characteristic of a single row subquery. If your subquery returns more than one row, you'll get the following error message. Single row subquery returns more than one row. Now you would have seen that if you've executed your subquery first, because if you execute your subquery first and it gives you one row, then it's fine. It's a subquery. But if you execute your subquery and you get more than one row of results, then you know you've got a multiple row subquery. That is why you have to know whether you've got a multiple row or a single row subquery. Now, as soon as you get this error message of a single row subquery returns more than one row, because it didn't return only one row and you've written a single subquery with greater or equal, etc., you have got one of two choices. Fix your subquery to return one row only, or change the comparison operator to either in, any, or all, whichever suits your query the best. The example in your textbook on slide 6-9 uses two subqueries of which each one returns one row or result. Both results are then used to complete the main query. I'm not going to discuss that example. The main and subquery can get data from different tables. That is also what you can do. Okay, the next session will cover then multiple row subqueries, as we are finished now with single row subqueries. Thank you.